Good evening, JR.
Hello, Phil.
How's it going?
Awesome. Couldn't be better, except it's
We
snowing,
got some
blowing,
wicked weather coming in, don't we?
sleet and everything else, Phil.
It's done a
Golly.
little bit of everything today.
Yeah,
I've seen sleet and snow and rain.
yep. I don't like it, but it's all right. You have to live through it, I reckon.
It's life.
That's life.
That's life. Jay, we're looking tonight in 2 Corinthians chapter 1
Right.
and then over in chapter 12. When we become Christians, we learn pretty quick that following Christ doesn't mean we're going to have a life of ease,
Right.
does it?
Yes, no. Right.
Sometimes we don't have the most pleasant of circumstances. Do you think we deserve it because we're Christians?
No, but sometimes we might think that. Sometimes we question, why is it happening to me? I'm a pretty good guy. I get up and go to church on Sunday. I give to the church.
But you know the scriptures tell us that you're going to have trials and
Yeah.
tribulations.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, he doesn't promise us anything but that.
Right.
But the other thing that he does promise is that he will not leave us, he will not forsake us.
Yep.
And so his presence is always with you. He says, I'll never abandon you. If our difficulties are pretty substantial, we're going to look more to Christ
Yeah.
than we normally would, wouldn't we? And his presence in our lives is good enough. Paul wrote a letter to, we know it's 2 Corinthians. He's trying to reestablish the relationship with the church. They'd had some false prophets in there kicking around and kicking up a lot of dust. So in this study, he opens up with a common introduction, you know, and thanking God for them and their presence and the work that they're doing. And then he followed with the declaration that God would comfort his people in their present suffering. The persecution there for them was great.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
They were living in a time of pretty severe trouble. And Paul had endured some things on his missionary trip. He hadn't really talked about them.
No.
And he doesn't give us details of it
No.
in here, really.
No, not really.
But in Asia, he'd run into some trouble. And his suffering deepened his appreciation of God's limitless compassion for him, and it drove him to identify with Christ's sufferings on the cross.
Yeah.
He doesn't really compare them, but he says, I can identify with him. So whatever punishment he was inflicted with, it was physical.
Yeah.
And
We think of Paul as a little old guy that pretty frail, but I think Paul must have been a pretty strong man if he took what the Bible indicates that he did. He was worked on pretty rough.
well, he was seeking to comfort them in the persecutions that they were going through.
Right.
Why do you think he hesitated about speaking about his personal experiences?
I don't think he wanted to. He thought it'd be bragging or something about what he had gone through, and he just didn't want to bring
He
that up.
talks about bragging,
Yeah,
doesn't he,
yeah.
in these verses.
Yeah.
But these false teachers and critics have maligned him for his lack of supernatural visions,
Yeah.
or at least sharing
Yeah.
what he had, if he had them. Paul wasn't sharing them, or any revelations from Christ that were special, and they were giving it to him pretty good. So he had to defend himself against these critics who had infiltrated the church there in Corinth. Otherwise, those false teachers would have buried the church. They were filling it with false doctrine, as it was, and he was there to correct that. But Paul goes on in the study tonight, and he described an extraordinary experience about himself in a vague way.
Right. Right.
And the experience occurred 14 years before his letter. So this is some time back.
Yeah.
You know, when his ministry really was very young.
Yes, it was.
He didn't offer any details about the time or place in these passages, but it was real nevertheless. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 10.
Yeah, of course, this is Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth. The first one was 1 Corinthians, as we know. He actually wrote 4, Phil, but 2 of them had been lost before they got published in the Bible, I guess. So he wrote several letters to them. And now, Corinth was a city, Phil, that we remember, I guess it was 3 weeks ago, we talked about Paul was on his second missionary journey, and he wanted to go to Asia, which is everyday or modern day Turkey.
Yeah.
He wanted to go on up further into Turkey, and God just kept saying, nope, you're not going there, I don't want you to go there, I don't want you to go there. And finally, Paul had this dream or vision, I guess it was, of a man in Macedonia, which is across the Aegean Sea from the end of Turkey, and would be the edge of Europe. That's where he was, and that's where Corinth is. It's right in that area where he left Asia and went over into Europe for the first time. And that's where the city of Corinth is. And so he says here in verse 1, chapter 8, verse 8 through chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, he says, we don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of our affliction that took place in Asia. We were completely overwhelmed beyond our strength, so that we even despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt like we had received a sentence of death, so that we would not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such a terrible death, and he will deliver us. We have put our hope in him that he will deliver us again. Paul doesn't really want to talk about what he went through, and he never does exactly say, except there's other times he talks about hardships and beatings and all those things. We know that Paul was beaten. We know that he was stoned one time. But he says, I don't want you to be unaware of it. In other words, I want you to know that I have suffered, just like Christ, but I have suffered. And he said, because of the affliction that took place in Asia, that was on his, over in the area of Turkey, where that occurred. He never exactly specified the nature of the affliction, but that it had occurred. He didn't even say where it was. Now, some people believe it was probably in Ephesus, maybe. We know that there was one gentleman in the Asia, in the Ephesus city of Ephesus, who was a Demetrius, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. He was a silversmith. And he went before the Jewish people and said, this man Paul is killing our business. Because they were making all these idols, golden idols to
trinkets.
Yeah, to Artemis, is that what it was, or to a god, a female god, and he said he's ruining our business, and besides that he's harming her reputation. Well, she wasn't anything but a made up story anyway, like a golden calf. You can't harm a golden calf. Yeah. But so they might have even thought that it was something that persecution from this man. He went to the Jewish people, and they kind of tried to get Paul to quit, and of course, we know Paul didn't quit, but Paul says during that time, he said we were complete. When he says we, he's talking about himself. Maybe he's talking about the people that were with him. We know we had some people with him too. We were completely overwhelmed beyond our strength. We've been there, where we have such turmoil in our lives, such hardship in our life, that we are overwhelmed. We don't know what to do. We don't know where to turn. We as humans, what we usually try to do is solve it ourselves. We almost always do that.
What's some common responses people have when they get in trying circumstances like that?
Well, they could.
I mean, what most people do when they get in trouble?
Turn to drinking? I don't know.
Well, I just think that they call on God.
Yes, they eventually do.
Eventually, when it gets bad enough.
When it gets bad enough.
It seems like all roads lead to there.
Yes, and that's what Paul did. Paul says he's gotten bad enough. He says we were completely overwhelmed beyond our strength. The intensity of the suffering that Paul felt was like he was hanging onto his life by a thread. And we've been there. We've seen times in our lives when we've had a loved one pass away or whatever, that we're just barely holding on. We can't already put one foot in front of the other one. We've seen that lots of different times in our life. Paul says, indeed, we felt like we had received the sentence of death. Sometimes we are in the point where we think death would be good.
Yeah.
We're overwhelmed by what's going on. What do? We say, well, I just might as well die. But then Paul says, I finally get to the point where that I cannot trust in myself, but I have to trust in God. And that's where we need to get to. He was to the point where he couldn't depend on himself to get himself out of this hole he was in, but he had to totally depend on God. And that's when things begin to turn around, Phil, and when we feel God's presence that close, then our situation begins to change. Paul says it so that we could not trust in ourselves but God. I like what the writer says here. He says, Paul threw himself on the protection of God, who has the power to raise the dead.
No one else.
No one else. His experience changed him. No longer would Paul rely on his own wits or abilities to overcome his afflictions, whatever they were. He would consciously and intentionally rely on a living God who would never leave him or forsake him. Then he says, God has delivered me from a terrible death, and he will deliver us again. God's past actions led Paul to believe that he would do it again. Whatever Paul needed, God would take care of it. He believed this because God had delivered him from trouble in the past, and he would deliver him from tribulations or trials, whatever he would encounter in the future. And finally, Paul says, we have put our hope in him that he will deliver us again. And the writer says this, having confirmed that God delivered him from past and present afflictions, Paul affirmed that he would do so again in the future, no matter what comes his way. This pointed to Paul's confidence in God's ultimate rescue from life's day-to-day problems for every Christ follower. Not only Paul in that time,
Right.
not only those people that were suffering then,
Me and you.
but it's us even today. Paul didn't want other believers to be unaware of the suffering that he and his group had endured. He wanted people to know he had endured suffering. He didn't go into great detail, but he wanted them to know. While sharing the gospel in Asia. Now, we sometimes have the opinion that we fake everything being fine. We don't like to admit sometimes we're having issues.
Faking fine.
Faking fine. Yeah, we don't want people to know we're having things going on in our life, right?
Yeah.
We want people to believe that we can take care of our own selves, take care of ourselves, and get through anything. The writer puts it like this, see, faking fine is meaning things will be okay if we pretend that they are. Paul's teaching us here that everybody has troubles. Don't try to fake fine. Admit what you have, what's going on, and turn to God, and he will get you through those times. Paul was making sure that the Corinthians were aware of what had happened to him, so that they would know when they suffer for Christ, he will be with them, because we're facing persecution, and would only get worse.
It's going to happen again. I think that's why he told them, he's going to do it for me again.
Yeah. This was probably written about 60 or so A.D. and the Romans, the persecution of Christians by the Romans ramped up after this. Got really bad in the late first century. Really, really bad. So,
and when we say really bad,
Yeah.
they were impaling them on spears and using them, lighting them on fire,
Yeah.
and using them for lamps at their parties.
yeah, that's
Now,
that's how bad it was.
That's about as bad as it gets.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
But Phil, we hear about what's the African country now that's almost doing the same thing? They're killing them Christians by the thousands. A small country in Africa, and it's not much different than that. That's persecution is still going on today in society, in the world. So Paul has set the stage. He has conflicts. He has inflections. He hadn't told us what it is, but he says, when I get to the point where I turn it over to God, then things begin to get better. And we'll do the same thing for us today.
we wonder why we have those circumstances to pop up.
Yeah,
It's just so God's grace will just come into our life
Yeah.
and sustain us, show us, you know, that He's there for us, remind us, I guess.
yeah,
Keeps us humble, doesn't it?
yeah.
Look at chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Paul says, "For if I want to boast, I wouldn't be a fool, because I would be telling the truth. But I'll spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me or hears from me.
Yeah.
Especially because of the extraordinary revelations. Therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to torment me, so that I would not exalt myself. Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me." So, Paul wasn't immune to persecution.
Mm-mm.
And he didn't want to, he said if he wanted to boast, he wouldn't be a fool because he'd be telling the truth.
Right.
But he still didn't want to tell people about some personal experiences that would perhaps make an uneducated person think, well, he's just bragging about his
Right.
relationship with God. So he limited what he was telling the people to what came out of his mouth, what he told, and what they could hear, and what they could see in him.
Yeah, see, I think that tells me that thorn that he had, whatever it was not a stick sticking out of him, but it was something that they could tell was hurting Paul, aching Paul, something that was bothering him, however it was, whatever, if it was pain or whether it was psychological, we don't know what it was, but people could tell when he was in one of those situations.
And they would see him being used by God
Yeah.
in his weakness.
Yes.
And while his opponents might have characterized him as weak or ineffective, they couldn't overlook that God had chosen him as an apostle and tasked him to found the church in Corinth. Where he says, "I'll spare you so that no one can credit me with something beyond what he sees in me and hears from me." He's just restraining himself from dwelling on those things. He didn't want to take the readers down the wrong path, or as I said, take an uneducated person and have them believe in something, you know, that the power was in him, or that it was he that had done something great. All he wanted to do was point to Christ with his life.
Does it matter what that thorn was to us? Does it make any difference for how we think about the situation? Not
No.
really, does it?
No.
It doesn't matter what it was. It doesn't matter what was physical or whether, say, talk about it might have been some blindness he had, or it could have been psychological. You know, we don't know.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of preachers would have come in there, these false teachers, and they just started railing on them, you know, just
Yeah.
rather than launching headlong into a sustained attack or a big confrontation with his opponents, where they had misrepresented him or themselves. He decided to just be quiet about some things.
Mm-hmm.
And he let the people to come to conclusion for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
People look at us, JR. We can talk till our heads spin around, but they look at us.
Yeah.
They see what we do.
And you know when they look, when you're not thinking
what-
they are, when you
well,
don't think
when-
they are.
In some of our most trying times.
Yes.
And it's in those times that God will sustain us if we lean on Him. But it's sometimes in those times we just get headstrong and we fail. Paul is telling us here that the true man of God focuses on declaring God's truth and doesn't draw attention to himself. And that's what he did. He wanted people to evaluate him based on what they could personally witness. So what was that thorn in the flesh?
I don't know.
But we don't know, but it prevented him from swelling up, didn't it?
Yeah, it did.
Getting proud and arrogant and all that. But he said God gave it to him.
Yeah.
This could have been a wound or something, or
Yeah.
something that happened to him in trying to get away from his oppressors. We just don't know. But whatever it was, it brought him some physical discomfort.
Yeah.
It was made him defective in some way or another. Some, well, they have all kinds of speculation, malaria, epilepsy, eye
Yeah.
disease, different things.
Yeah.
But whatever, when we have a thorn, you think of a thorn sticks in your skin, it's a sharp point, it causes pain right there at that point. He
Yeah.
had something causing him a great deal of pain.
And you hit it every time you move.
It was evidently pretty commonplace for him to struggle with it.
You know, it took a lot of faith in God for Paul, because Paul believed, as the writer says, he believed the thorn was the Lord's way of keeping him humble and dependent. A
The
lot of
writer
us,
also said that it was given by Satan and used by God.
yeah.
So that just goes to show us, you know, that whatever circumstance we fall into, God can use us in that circumstance to witness to somebody else.
Yep. Well, a lot of us would have just bucked up against God and said,
Pack it in.
"Why'd you do this? I haven't done anything to you. I'm, rebel against God." But Paul didn't do that, did he? He did exactly the opposite.
Paul talked about how he thought it was meant to curb his spiritual elation.
Yeah.
God don't want us to get too high. He don't want us to get too low. I think he likes for us to have an even keel about ourselves.
But Paul had done some great things for God.
He had.
He surely had. You think with all the people he'd witnessed to over his several years of ministry there, and he was still obviously was still in the middle of it.
When Paul said he prayed about this 3 times
Yeah.
and asked God to remove it, would that be humbling in itself? Having still woke up the next morning with it?
Yeah.
It would, wouldn't it?
Why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't you listening to me, God?
It-
3 times I've asked you this.
It deflated his pride as a tool of Satan. It brought him down to a place where God could use him
Yeah.
for Christ.
Yeah.
Whatever it was, the result of the thorn caused Paul to deepen his relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people speculate about the thorn and what it is. You know, maybe he was boasting some in his own merit. I don't know why
Yeah.
God gave it to him. But you know, a lot of times we'll say, we did this or we did that. You know, these things that Paul was about here, it's God doing it.
Yeah.
God starting the church, sustaining the church.
Mm-hmm.
So he wants all of us to remember that he is the source of everything that we have. And, you know, when we forget to look toward him, he has a way of drawing our eyes back as we fall, and get our feet tangled and our pride swelled and all those things. Well, he has a way of bringing us to our knees and humbling us through all these trying circumstances and bringing us back to him. You think when a weakness that you've had has brought about a greater dependence on God? You know, I thought when Marty was a baby and he got sick,
Yeah.
you know, wasn't very sick, but I was worried to death.
Yeah.
And I knew I'm powerless to do anything. you know, I can give medicine, but he's still got a fever.
Yeah.
What's going on, you know?
Yeah.
You learn real quick when you have kids that you're powerless.
Yeah.
And God's in control.
Yeah.
Let's look at that next verse.
So Paul has now prayed to God 3 times, and now he's telling us how God answered his prayer. In 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10, he says, "But he said to me," this is God answering Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, and my power is perfect in weakness. Therefore I will most gladly boast all the more of my weaknesses." This is Paul talking now. "Therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong."
And he is strong because he is in that relationship deeper.
With God. Yeah. The Lord answered Paul's prayer. He didn't answer it the way Paul hoped, but Paul understood that his answer was final. He said, okay, 3 times is enough. He didn't pray 7 times like you might have thought he would, because that's the whole number. If he said, okay, that's enough. I understand what you're saying. I'm good with what you're telling me. God said to him, "My grace is sufficient, and my power is perfected in weakness." When you're weakest, and I'm the strongest. God gave Paul a twofold promise. First, he assured him that the supply of grace for carry out his ministry would never run dry. I'm always going to be with you. I'm going to be, when you get your weakest, I'm going to be, as you said, I'm going to be your strongest. And second, he promised that the power of God would find its completion in Paul's weaknesses. When you get weak, then I'm going to ramp up, and I'm going to be stronger than you can ever imagine I would be. Through this weakness that Paul was going through, Paul had experienced God's grace and his power, and that grace and power interlocked with Paul's human weakness to bring about what God could only accomplish, and that is the strength that Paul needed to get through his ministry. Paul then says, "Therefore I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses." Paul declared that he would even take pleasure in his weaknesses and not hinder God's work in his life. And no matter what happens to me, I'm going to continue working, because you're going to get me through it. He would rather boast about his affliction than pray for its removal. When we get to that point, we might have overcome what weakness we have, when we can pray for God to use it rather than take it away from us. And that might be difficult for us to do sometimes.
Nobody likes feeling weak.
No.
Or feeling out of control.
Whether it's sickness, whether it's out of control, doesn't matter what it is. We don't like to feel like we're not in control, do we?
Well, that's what drives us to our knees.
Yeah, that's true.
In those places.
Yeah. Why would he ever again ask? Paul says, the writer says, why would he ever again want to ask God to remove his thorn in the flesh if it meant having that thorn was more glory for God? And can we do this, or do we do this? We say, God, we know what's happening. We know what you're doing. We're not going to ask you to take it away anymore, but continue to give it to me so that will give you more glory. Sometimes that glory that God gives us is other people seeing the things going on in our life, and God is given the glory because of how he gets us through those things. If we're going through something terrible in our life, but yet we still worship and praise and honor God, that's glory to God. And that's what Paul's saying. In those times of trouble, it brings more glory to God for what he does for us to help us get through those situations. Paul allows, or says, that Christ's power may reside in him. That's why he's going through things he is. Paul realized that he had a thorn in the flesh so that Christ's power would be magnified. That thorn was used to magnify Christ's power in his life by what he was going through. Then Paul finally says that, so I take pleasure in what witnesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties. Paul expressed his acceptance of the thorn, whatever that was, and the hardships that he faced. He said, I'm good with them because of how God is getting glory from what I'm going through. This didn't mean, Phil, that he no longer groaned or hurt or was in anguish or suffered because of the thorn. And no one would have blamed him if he did. But he not only boasted of his weakness, but the fact that it came from God, his relief from that thorn came from God and in God's power in his life. And finally, he says, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." When Paul acknowledged his weakness and expressed his complete dependence on Christ, he was immediately strengthened by Christ's resurrection power. When Paul acknowledged his weakness and expressed a complete dependence on Christ, which we have to do sometimes in our life, he was immediately strengthened by Christ's resurrection power. Instead of relying on his own energy, efforts, and understanding of the talent he had, he turned everything over to Christ and drew on Christ's wisdom and strength, and it made him a greater witness to the people in the city of Corinth and throughout his ministry as he walked through his ministry with Christ. When we're going through trying times like Paul, we can take pleasure in our weaknesses as we rely on God instead of ourselves. And that's not always easy to do. Paul had found that to be the case, so much so that he said, okay, I'm not going to ask you to take this thorn away. I know it's using it for your glory, and bring it to me, and we'll make it through together.
One of the things too, I think we don't just back out and not do anything.
No.
We're obligated to pray too.
Yeah.
And pray and watch him work, and that builds your faith. You think of how God strengthens you when you're having a trying circumstance like that. Just watching him work.
Yeah.
When you know you're powerless, and just seeing things fall in place where God wants them and how it all works out, it's a miracle. So we need to remember God's promise that he'll never leave us or forsake us, and that in our weakness, he's made perfect.
He's the strongest.
Sometimes we might want to write down, how when we are relying on God, how he works, rather than where we have tried to accomplish something ourselves and have seemed to get nowhere. Write it down, and we'll see how God works. Observe how he works and uses our weakness. Start practicing that, and then encourage somebody else who's going through a hard time, that they too can be used as a tool of God, just like Paul was. Whether it's a physical limitation or perhaps some uncontrollable situation that they're in, God can use us. He can use us in our weakness. And circumstances are not always controllable.
No.
And God can help us and sustain us through any of those circumstances, no matter how rough they get. It's a good study for us. It's encouraging, because we so often run into those things that we just can't control.
Yeah.
That's our study for tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. We enjoyed bringing it to you. Hope you can join us next week. We're going to look at another section here with Luke, where our understanding falls short. You ever have a situation, you think,
Why? What is this?
it makes you tilt your head like
Yeah.
that old dog gets you, looking at you kind of funny? It does. Life does that to us. We'll study about it next week. Hope you can join us.